Well, our first question from the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I am Atikur Rahman from International Fund for Agricultural Development based in Rome. My question to the panelist is not on agriculture. My question is in relation to the architecture of Copenhagen. The architecture and negotiations for Copenhagen is primarily country negotiations. The parties are involved. Yet we know that there are limits of solving climate change issues by involving countries only. We talked about involvement of the private sector. We talked about the civil society. Yet the formal architecture doesn't provide space for negotiations or talks with private sector. So this is one question, is that how do you feel and what do you see as the architecture providing space for the private sector, for civil society to come in and negotiating and talking about making some changes or committing or agreeing to some targets. This is one thing. Second question is in relation to the involvement of the private sector. Now private sector, by definition, they are moved by the profit motive basically. There was a move to make business out of carbon market, CDM for example. Do you think that other elements of climate change negotiation, can we make good business out of climate change for the private sector? Now this is a challenge, and what do you think as a panelist of making good business out of climate change? Is it possible? Is it doable? Or should we approach it in a more state interventionist way and get out of the private sector, get out of market and say that, okay, let's talk about more moralistic way of future generations, saving them and so on and so forth, saving planet Earth. Thank you very much.
Could I just clarify your first point? Are you proposing that private sector interests and civic society interests have an actual role at the negotiating table?
That's what I would like to see, because I think they are major actors involved. There should be space also for them to be involved in discussion. There are, of course, under UN Forum, there are some kind of limitations in terms of space. The countries are the sovereign countries. UN is a sovereign kind of, the parties are involved. But is it possible? I know that in Commission 1 and Commission 2 of CSD, Commission on Sustainable Development, more space now is being given to private sector, to civil societies. I think that that space is not still there in climate change negotiations. Although we know that major polluters are maybe in the private sector, and they have to involve, they have to be engaged. So that's the question. I don't think that anybody has got a solution now, but that is a question, that is a possibility, that is a vision. If they are part of the society, they are engaged in polluting or having a part in solution, I think they should be engaged and there should be space for them.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for those points. Halldor, perhaps you'd just like to tackle that first of all. I mean, you talked about 190 countries taking part in the process as it is, 160 odd days to go. I mean, what's your reaction to the idea of other players, albeit very important players, but joining this process?
Well, in my view, they are already firmly part of the process, and I would dread the situation if they gave up on us. And what has been particularly welcome, I find, the last two meetings is the youth that have come, and they've been reminding the negotiators about the fact that they will be inheriting this earth through a question, which is a very good question actually: how old will you be in 2050? And basically the conclusion is that most of the negotiators will be dead. The youth will be inheriting the results of the negotiations. And business has been particularly active in our process. More the proactive part of business, more the business that has been seeing opportunities in dealing with climate change. Other business interests are more exercised at the national level and perhaps act more as a brake on action. But I think there's major momentum both from civil society and business, and they are extremely important in our process. And they have been calling for action for quite some time, both of these. In terms of more formal involvement, as you indicated, I mean, there are structural issues there, but in the context of the Montreal Protocol, the business is much more directly involved than in climate, and so there are examples that could be followed.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I've been a member of the Climate Action Network, which is an international coalition of environmental groups that work on the climate talks for close to a decade now, and at every international meeting the group comes together. Many groups that don't see each other too often outside these meetings but work together through internet-based networks. They're involved in the negotiations. Sometimes there are persons who move back and forth between the delegations and the NGOs. Members of the NGO community actually propose negotiating text or models of negotiating text. The influence is actually quite dramatic, I think, and it's actually one of the situations where civil society influence has been greatest on the details of the negotiations. Civil society has done less good of a job, it turns out, I think, at actually building the public support for the kind of policies that are necessary. A great deal of energy has gone into, in some, forgive me for this, micromanaging the negotiations and less in building the politics that would make it possible to actually have a bigger deal.
Okay, José.
Yes, I would like to comment on the 2 points, private sector but also civil society. I would say that it's true that the international treaties deal with parties, with governments, with nations. And it's also true that we somehow refrain from going to the subnational level. So for obvious reasons, I mean, implementation is left to the sovereign power of the parties. But it's also true that the business is an essential player in this negotiation because they emit, but they have also to implement measures. We are all part of the economic cycle as consumers, as producers, as clients, and so on. And I have to say that the business is very sensitive and catch immediately the signals, and is not disclosing any secret, but many small delegations are less informed than a few lobbyists from the private sector that are there just either for lobbying or for taking the messages to their businesses, and this is very clear. So I think that the involvement of the private sector, and I would say as it is appropriate, is through the implementation of the measures that the governments, after consultation with the private sector, decide to implement. And it's well so. Now on the civil society. We have 2 very active groups so far, the private sector and also the green NGOs, so to say, which have been influencing, I mean, our colleague was a member of the Climate Action Network and so on. Given my personal views and also some opportunities I have had a lot of contacts with colleagues representing trade unions. And here in Geneva we are well placed. We have ILO, for example. And it has been a pleasure to collaborate with them and explain to them what is going on in the process. And just to say that, well, we talk about sustainability, but sustainability consists of 3 pillars, one being the social aspect. And these actors are coming slowly to in music, are coming slowly to the process, and it's necessary because, you know, well, I have a well-arranged speech I can serve to you off the record, but the social aspects are very important to take into account. I mean, because those who suffer most, as the 3rd assessment report of the IPCC said, are the poors, not only the poor countries, but the poors. We saw that during the heat wave, for example, in 2003,